Before we went on air, and we were talking about, I mean,
the long war against higher ed and humanities and social sciences.
The long run, yes. Well, no, we were on for that, but before we even came on for the Majority Report, we're in the 1920s in some respects right now. And there's no, we have Bernie, and Bernie matters, and Bernie's popular, but there's obviously Biden is very likely going to be the nominee. And if he's not, I mean, consider somebody horrific like Cuomo as well, right? Like, I mean, we're in a very, very bad shape.
Yeah.
What if we are in the 1920s? What does that tell us about the next several years from the perspective of, how bad it can get to what might need to happen to get us out of this predicament?
Well, if we think 1920s, the school books never really tell the 20s right. The term roaring 20s, it was roaring for capital.
Right.
Okay, roaring for capital. And if you look at the 1920s, it's actually the last decade of the Gilded Age that goes all the way back into the late 19th century. And the Gilded Age, and we're in at least the second Gilded Age, involved corporate power, concentration of power and wealth, and literally inequality growing. Now, do you mind if I mention a few statistics about this?
Of course not.
Okay, the statistics in the 20s seem to imply that household income was rising. So who would complain? But what it doesn't really reveal is that household income usually meant multiple workers in the family, in contrast to the past where it would have been a single worker, perhaps. So the thing is, inequality was increasing, and the stress and the pressure on working families. And by the way, farmers never recovered from the post-war recession, post-World War I recession. So you had this really growing inequality, wealth getting wealthier. We know that kind of story. And here's the thing. I mean, economists, progressive economists, liberal economists, socialist economists actually consider that the greatest cause of the Great Depression was the fact that workers couldn't even buy the goods and services they were producing themselves. They called it a lack of purchasing power. Now here we are, we're thrown in already to gross inequalities. We're confronting right now growing unemployment. I mean, what was it last week, 3.3 million, now we're up to 6.6 million. And we're just at the beginning of this whole process. And if you look on a map, there are certain sections of the country, the New York area and others, which have suffered this the most so far. The Southeast, hell, they're acting like it isn't even happening, but they're gonna see what that means. And out here in the upper Midwest as well, because Detroit and Chicago have become places where the number of cases have increased significantly. So the thing is, already inside of this crash, let's call it that, we're gonna see it intensify because we've seen for the past 45 years a class war on labor, which has smashed labor unions. And what that means is the capacity of workers to resist and to fight is going to be seriously hampered by the experience of those years. And how are we going to do it all the more? This is an even more unusual situation. We're all indoors. Right. And we're going to have to be creative. We're going to really have to be creative in terms of organizing online, creating solidarities online, joining unions online. I mean, joining associations that support unions online. And we're going to have to figure out ways of creating, if you like, I won't even use the word a new resistance because that's practically a word.
They destroyed that word.
Yeah, destroy that word. We're going to have to create a new kind of preparatory struggle. We're going to have to be ready, you might say.
Well, so then how can you fit things like the Amazon strikes, the Pittsburgh sanitation workers, the rent strike? So there's a lot of very good things that are happening because of really horrible things happening. Yes. There's an absolute necessity. I mean, Another thing this bailout did, of course, was no rent suspension. Andrew Cuomo vetoed a very modest piece of legislation here that would have frozen rent for 3 months. So things are happening. How do those acts of necessity start to congeal into something that's systemic from the grassroots?
Yeah, well, can I go back into history a bit for that?
Yeah, of course.
Mind? Okay, please. In 1930, 1931, American working people were not passive. Okay, they weren't out in mass necessarily, but there was a lot of turbulence, and the powers that be knew the threats that were coming into the public sector, so into the public realm. So, for example, let's start here in the upper Midwest, where I live in Wisconsin. It was the case that farmers were so utterly fed up with already more than a decade of suffering, you might say, of enduring low prices. And now with the Great Depression, or 31, they organized what was called, and we shouldn't assume this was any kind of summer camp thing, the Farmers Holiday Association. What it meant was they were going to keep commodities from getting to the market. Those who joined literally did not send their stuff into market. But they also went out on highways. They stopped trucks and they poured milk out when necessary. Now, when asked about what they were doing, these farmers said, "This is our Boston Tea Party. This is our protest moment." Then let's go to the bigger cities. Well, communists, socialists, and radicals organized respectively unemployed leagues, which staged protests and rallies on a fairly vast scale, thousands of people, and they marched. It's also the case that unions themselves in Detroit and elsewhere, I mean, there still was something of an auto industry despite the Depression. These folks organized, making demands on addressing their needs and the needs of the community. And moreover, most importantly, they were demanding a voice. Okay, keep in mind, there were no unions recognized inside of those industries of the 20s and early 30s, other than maybe company unions. Okay, then it's also the case that the bonus marchers went to Washington. The bonus marchers were the World War I veterans who had been promised a bonus for their service to be delivered in 1945. Who would have thought it would actually be the end of World War II at that time, if it ever happened?
Right.
And they're unemployed. They have families and they are scared. What are we going to do? Well, they got organized. They sent out word, we're going to march on Washington. And from all across the country, by rail, by car, by truck, whatever form it took, even if it meant getting in a wagon with horses, they descended upon Washington, D.C., demanding the payment of the bonus then. Now, I want to point out to people, because we have this idea that in the past, races were always divided. The bonus marchers were an integrated force who occupied Washington in an integrated fashion. Right. Now, they were smashed, and this is the warning. Douglas MacArthur, okay, Roosevelt, I think, called him the most dangerous man in America, okay? MacArthur led armed troops, to attack the bonus marchers. His lieutenants were Eisenhower and Patton, I believe. This is 1932. My year, I think, was 32, early 32. Now, they dispersed. And by the way, one of the groups made its way to New York City, and they actually set up a camp on the shoreline of the Hudson River around 79th Street. And there are shacks, and there are pictures available of this. I should have probably brought them along for the show.
No, it's fine. People can look them up. This is great. This is great.
And it's called the camp. Now, this is why I came across this by accident. They actually named their camp Camp Thomas Paine. Wow. I hope I can see a smile on your face now. Okay?
Yeah, you can. That's right. I love it.
Okay. And what did that mean? They called it Camp Thomas Paine. They were laying claim. They were taking hold of American history to assert themselves even in defeat. And that's significant. Moreover, it was an integrated camp down on the shoreline. And the New York Times, once upon a time, was a really great newspaper. They actually ran a series of stories covering Camp Thomas Paine, very sympathetic stories, makes for great literature. I'd like some playwright should actually write a play based on the many articles. And I won't go too far into that right now. But it is the case that they were very well organized. They every day got up, assembled in military ranks to show their discipline. And then they all went off across the city to get whatever jobs they could, to bring back whatever they could. And then they shared it collectively and cooperatively. Camp Thomas Paine. The tragic side of that is that Robert Moses, the great city planner, was determined not to let these kinds of things get in the way of building, what's it called? The Hudson River Park, the Henry Hudson. the West Side Highway.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So literally,
I think that's the Henry Hudson, right?
That is the Henry Hudson,
yeah.
right? Well, at a certain point, it's West Side, and then becomes Henry Hudson. Now, there's sort of a strange thing about this. Right next to the Camp Thomas Paine was, I think it was called it was like the Riverside Yacht Club. Okay, a motorized yacht club. So, but Moses didn't give any preference. He literally drove out the yacht club and these unemployed worker veterans. But of course, the yacht club could find its way higher up.
Yeah, the yacht club could figure it out.
Yeah, but it's the case that workers were already mobilizing, farmers were already mobilizing, and Franklin Roosevelt was well aware of this stuff. And there's an interesting thing he said in 1931 as he looked around as governor of New York. Okay, and he said, "I think it's time for this country to go fairly radical for a generation." And thus, even if he was not himself a socialist, he began to articulate, based on his own experience as a politician and his work during the war, First World War. And let us not forget, this was a man who was in a wheelchair. He knew from his conversations with socialist worker organizers in New York City, women who were organizing for the ILGWU and other unions, he knew that if you don't have health care, you are in deep trouble. Right. So when Roosevelt entered the White House, sorry, am I going on too long?
No, I love it. What I want to do is I want to move backwards and forwards because, so we have this moment. I think we've had many other conversations where we've complexified the New Deal, and there's very necessary criticisms, and there's also very, very necessary acknowledgments of the enormous accomplishment of it.
I'm with you.
And your work is obviously an indispensable part of it. And I do want people, as an example, to know, and one of my favorite examples that, President Lula, as an example, certainly read Roosevelt. And that this was Nestor Kirchner, I remember an interview with Oliver Stone, who was the center-left Argentinian leader, in just a moment that's kind of frozen in my mind because it's so depressing. He's talking with Oliver Stone between 2000, right before the inauguration in 2009 of President Obama, and he's talking about George Bush and the horror of the Bush era from the perspective of imperialism. And then he looked and he said, but I really hope that President Obama is the next FDR. So I just want people to know that even as FDR needs to be interrogated and critiqued and all the rest of it, without a doubt, not only is there an American progressive tradition, there's also, from my favorite angle, an internationalist respect for FDR as well, including in, leaders in the South. But
in fact, if I can just say,
please go ahead. I did too much there, but I do have questions. But go ahead.
I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right, because British socialists at the time were already making contact not only with leftists in America, but also with Franklin Roosevelt. And I think this is an important thing that we really had failed to appreciate these all too many years. Roosevelt transformed the meaning of the word liberalism, because in many ways he probably knew that if he went too far left rhetorically, he was going to have even more hatred spewed his way than he ended up getting. And I can tell you that if you look at FDR's, as you said, we know his tragic mistakes and the degree to which he empowers forces we may not have wanted empowered. But the more important thing is that he empowers working people. And if you look closely at what he called liberalism, it is social democracy. And I'm willing to argue about that with anyone.
Oh, I don't think there's any. I mean, I think that there's, I think there's a bigger argument about those other forces and the compromises and the international dimension. I think of course, what he called is liberalism is social democracy. And that's actually the only reason that we still have some positive associations with the word liberal is because of those accomplishments. I don't think that part's debatable at all. But anyways, so there are these accomplishments, and then they kind of ride through with the contradictions, I think, reaching their height in the 60s of the horrific imperial policies of Kennedy and LBJ, the genocidal slaughter in Vietnam, and alongside, the real heightening of the contradictions of butter at home, guns abroad.
Okay.
There is some progress in terms of the next phase of the New Deal in the 60s. And then there, of course, Nixon is this criminal and this, but he sort of he says we're all Keynesians now. But then starting with Carter, this consensus is broken. And we're in a time now, and I'm really, on one hand, there's the very simple idea and a very important idea of the idea of getting back into the discourse, the idea of completing an American New Deal, which everybody from Adolph Reed to you have sort of put forward in various different ways, in ways that can go extremely radical. And then I want to couple that with the fact that, clearly in the last several decades, and we're really reaching the heights now, that the Democratic Party, I don't think it's that they don't know that history. I think they quite clearly, as Marshall Steinbaum pointed out today, they want a base and a party of essentially mostly affluent suburban white voters. They are not interested in the new working class. They are not interested in the urban or the rural in any significant way. And I don't, and I think that's a product of the globalization of capital, of political consultants replacing labor parties, all the work that Stephanie Mudge and Mark Blythe have done, and really showing how these center-left parties have changed institutionally. So what's the bridge there if you want to reclaim that legacy, but also recognize that on a political and institutional level, it isn't necessarily an educational or it's a power one. It's a real shift in terms of what they see as their constituency.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. One thing we saw in these recent primaries is the degree to which African Americans have actually rallied, especially older African Americans, have rallied to Biden.
Sure.
And I think it's interesting that, folks like Michael Eric Dyson has endorsed Biden. But when push came to shove, I think the answer was, well, we vote pragmatically. African Americans vote pragmatically. They weren't convinced that Bernie could produce on the kinds of things he promised. I lay that out because this is important. I think it's imperative that the kinds of things we've seen emerging in Bernie's movement, I think it's imperative that the multiracial and it's been this integrated force. It's really remarkable. And we've got to figure out a way actually to build on that and not merely be satisfied with it. And
Can I ask though? Yeah. I think the African American vote, and actually I'll announce it soon. We're going to do a specific stream on this with Adolph Reed and some other people about just the problems of even just the media narrative around one singular African American vote is very essentializing and problematic.
Yeah,
but even regardless of that, it doesn't. I think especially in a place like South Carolina, it would make a lot of sense that people across the board who are voting Democratic, and obviously including many older African American voters, would have a sense of frankly voting defensively and being very concerned about how extreme a threat we're in. So to me, I think that story is important, and it's very important to complexify, and we need to talk about it. But what I'm specifically interested in right now is Nancy Pelosi. Zach Carter put out something earlier about, some new something. I'm forgetting the legislation, but something with suburban home ownership. The point being that, of course, the Democratic Party, I think that's the very old arrangement. Look, if you're a person of color, if you have a remnant connection with a decimated labor union, who else are you going to vote for? The other side absolutely wants to destroy you, will occasionally maybe give you a little respite. But I want specifically to look at the dynamic of a leadership of the Democratic Party that really, I think at the end of the day, not only is its axis not of some sort of working class, it doesn't want it to be. And it wants to build a center base out of the suburbs. That's where it sees its future.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with you about. Oh, sorry.
I'm just curious the answer to. I know you're not. Yeah.
One thing I should make clear. I don't know if everyone follows. I hope they do the Michael Brooks show as closely, but you and I are pretty close. Okay, so I didn't think that I agreed with what you said about what the Democratic Party leadership is doing. So I didn't know how much I needed to go on from that. But I think it is the case that we've got to figure out. We have to figure out how we go forward so as not necessarily to forget. And I'm not one of these advocates of white versus black or people of color working class, but we have got to figure out how we're going to actually engage the white working class. That last time was very keen on Bernie. And I think that's part of our task. And by the way, I actually think that the more we move into a decidedly social democratic, and when I say social democratic, I am not talking liberalism, okay? I'm talking social democracy in its truly both American and internationalist form. And I think that it's imperative that we work out how to articulate that and also how to organize around that. And I think this is the moment that we need to do it. In other words, I know we've got the horizon, and you've got a broader horizon, a longer horizon than I do, frankly. But I think we are in a, knock on wood, man.
Yeah, knock on wood. We'll see.
Okay. But I do think it's imperative that these kind of conversations take place now, but that my biggest fear is that we not break down into the left of the past, the divisions of the past, that we build a left that's comprehensive, but that we on the left have a major say in its progress. Okay, that's my point. And to do that, we have to master. I'm not just talking about, I do think there's a process of historical education, but I think it's also a matter not just of what rhetoric we use, but what we aspire to do. And I think if we can't aspire to address the immediate and long-term interests of working people, then we're in deep trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Kaye, as a final question, we talk rightly, and we can go back in history to the 80s. We can look at Laurie Jarrett's work on the broader neoliberal assault on the public health infrastructure. And then, of course, we can talk about the Trump administration dismantling pandemic responses and all of this, these horrific decisions that have led to where we are. Do you think that there is, it's not a direct analogy, obviously, but I want to do a cultural analogy of that the assault on history is a discipline. And so that the fact that people don't know about A. Philip Randolph, or they don't even know that, the March for Jobs and Justice was this incredible radical event of dismantling American apartheid and delivering that social democracy for all, because of course it wasn't in the first iteration. That, or even just having any understanding of the history of labor movement in this country that isn't like, an addendum character in some, fun gangster movie.
Yeah.
What is the consequence, and how are we seeing it play out today of not knowing our history?
Well, look, we're bombarded by rhetoric right now, okay, in the midst of the crisis. This may not be what you have in mind, but I can tell you what's been on my mind. So immediately, for example, we have seen columns appear that grab hold of FDR. And they talk about FDR who reassured Americans, FDR who mobilized Americans to work in the New Deal. But what they don't talk about is that FDR himself believed it was imperative for him to engage and encourage working people and to have labor unions capable of organizing on a grand scale, not only so they could defend themselves in the workplace and make demands on things, but literally so they could push him. He knew that you do not create liberalism, social democracy, socialism, whatever, if your leaders themselves are not compelled to do things. So when he took office, okay, in the very first National Industrial Recovery Act, for all of its failings, was written in labor's right to organize. Now, there were flaws in it, and they returned to that in 1935. But in 1935, Roosevelt himself said, new laws in themselves do not bring the millennium. What he said was, his people went out and called on not only workers, but housewives and others to organize, so that, you know, somebody caught me yesterday when I did the Rising with Crystal, and somebody sent me a note after and said, you use the word mobilize a lot. How about organize? And I said, sorry, I was using a term that I think of that's comprehensive, but I think that's imperative. I mean,
I think mobilize might be more to the point, maybe, at any rate. But
yeah,
so just to underline it, if you know history, there's no way you can write, can Andrew Cuomo be the next FDR with a straight face?
That, you know, I'm close to Katrina, and that one really, I actually went, whoa, you know.
I mean, honestly, I didn't even know that Katrina Vanden Heuvel wrote it. I just saw the headline and thought, are you kidding me? I mean, I'm sure Katrina, you know, has good intentions with it, but I mean, no, quite literally not. He's fighting for Medicaid cuts and to depress labor in the state right now.
Yeah, well,
even if he's reassuring us in press conferences.
Well, look, obviously, if there was a lefty working at CNN as Cuomo speaking to the cameras, and they give him 2 hours a day, it seems, or at least an hour, underneath the bar should be reading, "This is the same man who was looking to shut hospitals in Brooklyn."
Right.
Right.
There it is, Professor Harvey J. Kaye. Please stay safe, stay healthy, read history. And take back our history.
Take hold of our history.
Take hold of our history. Sorry, I have it.
Right.
See, you think I have a longer horizon. My memory is completely failing. All right, Professor Kaye.
Can't wait to see you in person, Michael. And please, if anyone's interested, Harvey J. Kaye on Twitter.
Yes, we'll have a link.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Kaye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.